Hello, friends. Today's podcast question says, how can I help my daughter think biblically about yoga when many of her friends are participating in it? Is it okay for Christians to participate in yoga? Now, I'm really grateful to be able to answer this question because I answered a question about yoga in a previous Foundation Worldview podcast. And for many of the comments that we received on YouTube, it became clear that I did not clearly communicate in that podcast. So I'm grateful to have another opportunity to answer a similar question about yoga. So that's what we're going to dive down deep into today on the Foundation Worldview Podcast, where we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. I'm your host, Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I'm thrilled that you've joined me for this episode today. Now, before we dive in, if you found the content of this podcast beneficial, please take the few seconds that it takes to rate and review or like and subscribe to this podcast. Doing so helps both you and us. It helps you by making sure you don't miss a future episode, and it helps us by making sure this content gets out to equip as many Christian adults as possible. Now, in order to answer this question, how can we help a child think biblically about yoga? I think the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, in this particular situation, what kind of yoga is being done? Now, if if their friends are involved in yoga at a secular yogurt, almost made it sound like yogurt. If they're involved in a secular yoga studio, the yoga that is being done there is more than just a simple exercise in stretching. It's actual involvement in Hinduism. Now, in preparation for this podcast, I found an article that I thought was really helpful. It's put out by the Cleveland Clinic, and it's called Yoga versus Pilates, the difference between two great exercises. And I think this article is helpful because a lot of times people think of yoga and Pilates interchangeably, where this article makes clear how yoga is vastly different. So in a quote from this article, it says, Pilates was invented by a German anatomist in 1926 as a way of conditioning the body and providing rehabilitation to World War I veterans. The practice quickly grew as a means of building core strength and improving endurance, particularly for those in the field of ballet and dance who were seeking rehabilitation from injuries. The goal was to help people with injuries to heal using core strength and guided exercises. Yoga, on the other hand, is rooted in a centuries-old spiritual practice meant to enhance your mind-body connection to achieve enlightenment. But traditional yoga is more than just a workout routine. It's a lifestyle that embraces a philosophy and a set of tenets built around nourishing your physical, emotional, and spiritual growth. Yoga teaches you how to navigate life by creating and honoring boundaries, embracing a no-harm mentality, surrendering to the divine, and aligning your mind, body, and spirit. Okay, so this is from a secular source from the Cleveland Clinic, and it's making clear that yoga is more than just simple stretching, that it is a whole lifestyle that is involved, that is rooted in spiritual practices. Now, the ultimate goal of yoga, as it was designed in the East, was to join human beings with an ultimate impersonal being called Brahman. Now, the word yoga actually means to yoke. So the goal of yoga is to yoke yourself with this ultimate impersonal being. So yoga started in the East, and it was eventually brought to the West. It was brought to the United States by a man whose name I am going to mispronounce, not purposely, but just because it's long and somewhat difficult. But the man's name was Paramahansa Yogananda. So I have no idea how far off I was on that, but that was his name. And he and others who were kind of the forefathers of yoga in the United States, they knew that in the US, yoga would not be embraced if it was made clear that it was this way of yoking yourself with this ultimate impersonal being, Brahman. And so what this man, I'll say his name again, Paramahansa Yogananda, maybe if I say it 5 times fast, eventually I'll get it. He and others, what they did is they linked yoga to the already popular health and wellness trend in the US to hide the spiritual aspects that Americans would have been uncomfortable with. And so this type of yoga that's done in secular yoga studios, that has these positions that were designed to yoke a person, to unite a person with Brahman, and a yoga studio that's teaching you that yoga is this way of life, that it's how you have this mind, body, soul connection, and it's how you embrace a no harm philosophy, and it's how you yoke yourself to the divine. This is unbiblical. It's not just stretching. It's engaging with this entire false religious system. So to the person with this question, if this is the type of yoga that your daughter's friends are involved with, you need to directly talk with her about this. I would recommend that you read the article from the Cleveland Clinic. Just search yoga versus Pilates Cleveland Clinic. The article will pop up. You can also watch this video with your daughter. If your child is age 10 or older, another form of media that you can engage with, if you just Google Beckett Cook yoga. Beckett Cook, on his show several years ago, he did a podcast with a friend of his who is a former yoga instructor. And she just goes through all of these things that I mentioned in much, much more detail about the history of yoga and how deeply rooted yoga is in Hinduism. So this form of yoga is not biblical. We need to help our children understand this. And we need to make sure that while they are in our homes, they are not engaging with this type of yoga. Now, there are other types of yoga. For example, I know that there is yoga that is done within Christian context. For example, just several miles down the road from me, there's a very large church that has a gym in its facility, not just like a physical, gym where you can play basketball. They have that, but they also have like weight rooms, dance classes, a track, all that kind of stuff. And at their gym, which is open to the public, you can get a membership there. They have yoga classes that they teach daily. Now, in these yoga classes, I know that the traditional yoga positions are still used. And these are the yoga positions that were designed to yoke a human with Brahman. And they're still used. However, the encapsulating philosophy of this mind-body connection and of this surrendering to the divine, they are absent. Okay, that usually it just involves some quiet music, stretching in these yoga poses, and breathing. Now, I know that there are many biblically faithful Christians who practice this type of yoga. If this is the type of yoga that your daughter's friends are engaging with, I would encourage you to talk with her about this. Talk with her about the type of secular yoga that there is, and then this type of yoga that her friends are engaging with. And I would encourage you to discuss how some Christians do engage in this type of yoga that does not contain the same spiritual elements as traditional yoga. Now, this is where I got in trouble on the last podcast, because this is what I mainly focused on the last podcast, that it's important to mention that there are Christians who choose to engage in this type of yoga. And the reason that I'm saying this is we don't want to make some sweeping claim like, no faithful Christian does yoga, or yoga is something that all Christians should avoid. Because if we do make that sweeping claim, and then later our children learn, wait, my mom taught me that no real Christians do yoga, but I know some real Christians now who do participate in yoga. This will then lead our children to question so many of the other things that we have taught them that were absolutely true. So we don't want to make sweeping claims like that. However, even though some Christians do engage in this type of yoga that's often done at Christian studios and doesn't involve all of the spiritual elements, I would still encourage you to encourage your child to stay away from even this form of yoga, especially when we have something like Pilates that's available. Pilates does not have, at least to my knowledge, any of the same spiritual baggage that yoga has with it. So just encourage your daughter to get involved in Pilates or something like that. She can even invite her friends, to a class with her. Now, I recommend that Christians stay away even from these Christian forms of yoga for several reasons. The first reason is even a Christian yoga class can mistakenly include some elements of Hinduism in it. And this is spiritually dangerous. That a lot of people have not taken the time to research the history of yoga, where yoga came from, what the different positions were designed to do. And sometimes they might include some more of the spiritual elements in it, not realizing that these are pagan worship practices. So that's the first reason why I would encourage you to encourage your daughter or any child in your care to stay away from even yoga that is done in a so-called Christian environment. The second reason that I would encourage this is that even if a yoga class is just doing some normal stretching, like let's say, that they're not even using traditional yoga poses. They're just calling it yoga, but they're just doing some stretching that's healthy for the body. It could lead other Christians to stumble, and it could even potentially keep non-Christians from the faith. What I mean by this is a less mature Christian or a less discerning Christian could go to a yoga class with you, or they could see you attending a yoga class and they could think, oh, yoga is harmless. Or they could go to that yoga class with you and think like, oh, all yoga classes are like this. It's just some stretching and some breathing. And then in their mind, they've created a category in their mind that, yeah, yoga is an okay thing for Christians to do. Then they might sign up for another yoga class in the future that is completely different and that is deeply entrenched in all of the spiritual elements of yoga and have no idea that they are placing themselves in spiritual danger. So I would encourage you and your daughter and any other child in your care, to stay away even from Christian versions of yoga for this reason. Now, if you do decide that, there is this yoga class that's offered at a Christian studio, there's none of the elements of Hinduism involved. I still want to be involved in it because it's really important to stretch and stay healthy. If you do choose to, to attend a yoga class like this, I would just encourage you, make sure that anyone who goes with you and anyone who sees you attends understands that there are dangers in other forms of yoga and that what you are doing in this class is different, because scripture is clear that we are to do everything in our power to make it so that our brothers and sisters in Christ do not stumble. And so it's really important that if we do decide to attend yoga, that those who know that we're doing it or those who are participating with us understand that this type of yoga is different. In fact, it's probably not even really yoga. It's just stretching. It's not yoking yourself with a Hindu god. So that would be my encouragement. First, understand the difference between yoga that's done in a secular way, that's this all-encompassing religious system, and yoga that's done in what might be called a Christian context, that's just stretching. And if you're someone who currently leads yoga classes or you attend a yoga class in a Christian context, would encourage you to consider calling it a different name. If genuinely all you are doing is stretching, call it stretching, level 1 or something like that, because you don't want to confuse people of something that is healthy for them, just stretching, with an entire spiritual and religious system that is based in falsehood. Well, that's a wrap for this podcast. But if you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you can submit that question by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. As we leave our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of His Son. I'll see you next time.